Hi.
My name is Madeline Hagan. I am a historian with the firm Historical Research Associates in Portland, Oregon. Today I am interviewing Kelly here on behalf of the Historic Trust for their Officers Row Memories Oral History Project. We are recording in the Marshall House on Officers Row in Vancouver, Washington. Today is November 4th, 2024. Kelly, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Kelly Punteney. I've been here in Vancouver since 1971, which is over 50 years now. I came here from the University of Oregon as an intern for the Parks and Recreation Department that summer, and been here ever since. I worked for the City of Vancouver and started with the programs with Central Park program in '72.
So tell me about that internship.
That internship lasted 3 months, and the city basically was looking for somebody to deal with their tree problem shortly after the Columbus Day storm of '62, and we're doing a lot of replanting, and those trees were starting to get to be a size where they needed some management and care, and more trees needed to be replacing the ones that had been lost. So between that and other public works projects, they asked me to come up, but I am a Parks and Recreation major with an urban planning background. So the combination of the two as a landscape architect and a Parks and Recreation administration degree, I came to the city and never left.
Yeah. So how did that internship, lead into working?
Well, that first year I was working on projects like writing a grant for a marine park down on the Columbia River, and I've supervised several landscape projects up on the Dairy Queen Island and Mill Plain, Fourth Plain tree plantings, and that was basically what I did for that summer. And then they asked me to come back the next year because we had we'd received a grant to build Marine Park after we wrote the grant that summer, the summer before. Mm-hmm. And so I came back to follow up on that grant and see that it was built. Mm-hmm. So I spent the first couple of years doing that as well as working on trees throughout the community.
Yeah. So not so many years before you started working on Central Park and Officers Row, can you tell me how you got to work here?
Well, the Officers Row was a big part of what was going on when we started hearing about, we'd heard about Officers Row for years because it was owned by the VA hospital at the time, and the buildings were falling apart, and it was really quite depressing to drive down this street here, Evergreen, and the trees were constantly crashing, what was left of them after the Columbus Day storm. And of course we knew about the damage that had happened to the houses in '62, so there was a lot of work to be done, and it just felt like this row was going to be lost. Downtown had been devastated by taking old buildings down that had a lot of character and history to the community. So it was a high priority within the city, and me being a landscape architect in the trees here, and the interest in replacing trees and in adding the trees, it was a natural to be involved in this. Mm-hmm. So that was what started me that first year. My last year at college I spent in Europe, and I had studied urban landscapes, urban design over there, and was really into both pedestrian movement and landscape tree selection, urban city urban forestry, and it just fit really well, and the city and I just got along real well. Mm-hmm. So I continued, and I thought I would leave eventually, but it ended up I stayed for 36 years.
So tell me about the early days of this project of Officers Row.
The early days when we first, when it was here, this house was a Red Cross house, and it was in pretty sad shape, and it was white with a red roof, very, very Red Cross looking, and I bought a house just right at the end of the block here, and so I lived in the neighborhood. I drove this street all the time, and with the Central Park plan that was being pushed by City Council, Ethel Lehman and a whole group of people got together and wanted to really see what we could do that we could do a better job with the entire original military base, which was almost a mile square, a little longer, but the riverfront to Fourth Plain, and that was 13 agencies that they were trying to get to agree on everything, and it was very difficult at the time, but the city seemed to have a very strong interest in it. The city council was very historically oriented. They were upset about the loss of a lot of the history downtown and the loss of because of the Columbus Day storm, and so I was brought in on those projects, and with my urban planning background, they had a group of architects and landscape architects come in from all over the country to do a seminar or retreat on what to do with the entire area, and they decided the south end should be historic and based on the military and its history there. North end would be more recreational, educational. And that division was in the back alley here. So on the other side of the fence is ball fields, and this side is all historic. So my interest in history didn't hurt a lot, because I sure enjoyed working with all the history, and I ended up in 1982 buying a house right at the end of the row here. So I live right across the street today, and so I look right down through this whole row. So it wasn't only a job, but it was a passion of mine to see this be successful. And as we went along, we got started, and of course we got stopped. We were moving forward with, first the VA didn't want anything to do with the city taking the property, and I think Jimmy Carter, his administration, kind of agreed with us to acquire the property, and we started working, and then the administration changed, and Reagan came in, and he put everything on hold for a bit. That was just part of the politics of it all, and so we had started with this house being a restaurant, and I did the landscape plan for, you've seen the picture of the sidewalk. We moved it away from the trees so we could save the big old trees instead of cutting the roots and damaging the health of the trees. That project was one that I worked a lot on, and I didn't do the actual building, but I did the landscape around everything. And that once we got back on track after the Reagan administration agreed that the city could take over the property, then we started looking at it in a more historically accurate point of view, and the sidewalk was decided to go in its original spot, and the trees would have to, well, there was a lot of damage to the trees anyway, so we infilled with new trees. And in 1989, I was in the project for the Washington State Centennial was to plant trees here on Officers Row. So we had every, I think they were fifth or sixth graders, I don't remember exactly, each school came, and one day on Arbor Day of 1989, we had all those thousands of students here planting the trees. And you see the plaques at each tree today from that planting. So that was the start of a new generation of trees here. And certainly the sidewalks were put in place, and a lot of the other trees didn't survive that trimming. So those trees now are huge, and now we've got another generation of trees. But at that time it was a big deal, and we tied the state centennial, 100th anniversary of the state, to Arbor Day and Earth Day, and did all that with the students. And since that time, I've had students come up and say, I remember when, and they planted. And there was 1,000 or more of them, so that was a big deal. that really gave us a lot of, these kids are grown up now, and they're in their 30s and 40s, or probably 50s. So they are the people that really know and feel an ownership to this, and that's been a big deal for this community.
Yeah.
And so,
Tell me about working with historic landscapes.
well, historic landscapes, you've got, well, like big leaf maple is not a recommended street tree. It is here, and we changed the rules, the laws to plant the trees here as historical character. The maples work, but I'd just been in Europe and I studied varieties of street trees, what works in cities with very little space. So obviously I wanted a variety of trees, and we did get. There was some comments at times about all native indigenous trees, and of course there's a lot of newer varieties of trees, cultured trees, and London plane trees that is a very common tree all over the world for street trees. I did those downtown, but we chose here to go ahead with the big leaf maples. I did plant other trees along the other side of the row. In some cases you see some other trees, but the decision, there was things like the big rhododendron out here that was planted. It was a beautiful tree at the time, a rhododendron at the time, and I really wanted to see that staved. And we fought about keeping that, even though they were kind of getting rid of everything close to the building. So it's still here today. That's kind of exciting. We were involved in what they called Nahunga art exhibit, and the community that I worked with, the landscape community, we had what they called the Landscape Commission, the City Landscape Commission, and I was staffing them, and they wanted to do the Nahunga exhibit as part of the art exhibit that was here in the house. So we put a whole exhibit out on this east side of the house, and as part of that summer that we had the exhibit here. And then that stuff all moved over to the Japanese Gardens in Portland. And the one big vine or lace leaf maple is still here that we put in. It's the one right out here on the corner. It's huge now. It's beautiful. Anyway, that was one of the projects. But basically, when we went forward with the projects, we were pretty much tied to what photos showed. And there wasn't any issues on it. It just moved forward. It was simpler, actually, except it was much more expensive to do. And so that's just the way it went. And those two columns out by the front walkway, they had been moved over. You'll see in a photo in '86 where we did a sidewalk that was further to the house. We were going to do that all the way down the Officers Row, but the decision was made to put it out of the street. So that all got torn out and redone out there. And down at the Grant House, I did the little design based on the photograph where the sidewalk splits, doubles around a little entrance there, based on photos. And then we did brick pavers in there to pay for that. The brick pavers aren't historic at all, but that had been done, and they kind of decided to just leave that alone because the look of the project, the way the sidewalk split and circled around a little center planting, was decided that was close enough to the original design that they hung on to it. And so that project's still there. And then we did the little plaques all along with historic vignettes, I guess is the word for it. I bought one of those. I got my name on one down there, because it's close to my front yard. So that's there. And then after that project, the old Howard House came a little later. And the early part of that, I'm not sure how that exactly came about, but towards the end of the project, I ended up taking that project over as a project manager. And there was a lot of issues because it really went way over budget, but it was going to be a beautiful place, and so the landscape plan was pretty much mine, with a lot of input from a lot of people, and photographs certainly did dictate what we did. I think the plazas out on the northeast side of the house didn't comply with it, but they served a purpose of being able to have events outside, off the doors of the building. So that was a big part of it. And then we'd planted a lot of trees, and we did the rose garden out there based on Ed Lynch's desires. And the benches that we put in all along here, that was a design that was developed by a local company here. We call them the Renaissance benches, because I was also doing the waterfront Renaissance project. And so we got them to design and come up with those special design for us based on the period of what we were going after. And Portland had the bench that was more period to the 1800s, but we wanted something similar but not the same. So the Cascade company came through with building or designing a bench, and then of course we bought them for along the waterfront and here, and they're still here today. The garbage cans and everything became part of that from the waterfront. Mm-hmm. I also was involved in what we called the walking loop, historic walking loop. I think you've probably seen the brochure of that. Mm-hmm. And that was a 2.5 mile. That was before the land bridge was built. We had hoped the land bridge would be built 15, 20 years before it was. We couldn't wait for that, so we did a loop that allowed us to go down around the Pearson Air Park and down under the railroad tracks at an opening already there along the waterfront and come up through downtown and back through Officers Row. Yeah. With its looping was 2.5 miles, I believe.
Yeah, how did that come about?
Well, that was just part of the walking. We were into this whole movement of people getting out and walking for health reasons, and one of the ways to have people really appreciate things is to get out of the car and walk on this property. We had the sidewalks here, we had the pathway across on the other side of the road, other side of Evergreen here, and it was just a natural. So tying that all the way around where people could park and walk the loop and get back to their car worked really well. And it covered the historical aspects here, the fort, the waterfront, downtown, all in one loop. And it was very popular. We really got a lot of praise for that project. It was good. Another project that I was involved in is the Evergreen Arboretum. It's the little piece of property down here, and that came about in 1978, 79. Actually, it was dedicated in 79, but it took quite a few years. That was all privately funded and done before we really had acquired the property. So that project was kicked off from wanting to honor. There was a head of the Democratic Party and the head of the Republican Party in this community. Both died the same year, and the widows wanted to do something for their husbands here in the community. And they were both tree advocates, Sylva Bowles and Betty Avery, and so they got a group together and came to the city and said they wanted to do something honoring and to deal with trees in general. So Jean Norwood was a former city councilman. She led the charge. And of course, I was the staff person they put on it because that was my bag, and so we got that started, and we started that under the Chamber of Commerce, and not as a nonprofit, and then eventually it got tied under the Community Foundation. So we were one of the first funds of the Community Foundation back under Mary Granger, back in I guess it was probably 82, 83 before the Community Foundation started. Mm-hmm. But that still exists. And this summer, we unfortunately, we closed that account and used the remaining money to re-roofed that little gazebo down here at the end of Officers Row. And that still remains the Evergreen Arboretum. We moved the thought of the Evergreen Arboretum to a property down on the old Evergreen Highway to the Jane Weber Evergreen Arboretum, and merged those two into one, and now it's a nonprofit down there. But the roots started right here on the Officers Row.
Tell me about the design here on Officers
The
Row
design
for
was
the
done
Evergreen.
here. I've basically worked with local designers here, and we came up with the design locally, and the trees that were put on there came from down here on Evergreen. They were widening the street. We moved the cherry trees down to this property. There's still two of them there, and then every year we would plant another tree on Arbor Day there, and so most every tree that was planted in there was on Arbor Day, celebrating the second Tuesday in April of every year. So a lot of years the Arbor Day plantings were there, and then we had a number of memorial funds that came to us, and every time somebody would pass away, $1,000 would be donated to the Evergreen Arboretum, and we built the gazebo in the first place. And then if you notice, there's bricks with names of the donors. Then at one point, I believe in about 92 maybe, we did the water feature that's down there, that beautiful bronze art piece that's in the pond there. And so that's still there and doing well. And of course, that had we engraved in the stone of that the name Evergreen Arboretum. So eventually, as the National Park Service and things changed, we moved away and went down to the Evergreen Highway, and now that's pretty much managed by the Row or the Park Service, or I'm not sure which is actually doing that now. I think it's probably more the Heritage Trust. But.
Yeah, tell me more about that change with the National Register.
Well, I was involved when we moved forward with the Reserve Trust, and I sat in on all the early meetings when it was the 5 agencies. It was the Army, the state, the city, was the PUD involved in that? Let's see, there was Army, state, city, federal government, and Army. That's 5. So we sat in on those meetings at Park Service, and of course we were dealing with Pearson Air Park, the Row, Howard House, all that, and how that's all going to be administered, plus taking on more of the property as the Army stepped away from the property. And so that, just many, many long meetings. John Marshall was involved in that. I had been made assistant to the city manager at that time. I went to be assistant to the city manager in 1991 or 91, somewhere in that era, and I was there till 95 or 96. And in that period of time is when we were developing all that. And it came together slowly but surely. And today's program, or Heritage Trust, is based on that work that was done. And there was ups and downs with that, but it all, I think, came out in pretty good shape. I was a big fan of Elson Strawn, and Kent Shorthill was with the city. I worked with him a lot, and then he came over and ran that. And even as recently as Stacy Graham running it just a couple of years ago, or a year ago, Stacy and I were good friends, and so I've stayed in tune with that for years now. And it's good to know that they're doing things like what we're doing today to keep this history alive, because it is a pretty amazing project, and certainly is a model for others to follow. We think it's a great model, and I'm glad to be part of it.
Yeah.
But I spent a good 30 years of my life working on it. And of course, I live right at the end of the row today, and still get to appreciate everything that's growing. It's good to see yet the third generation of street trees being put in, and the ones that, like the one immediately out front here, is one of the originals, and I'm glad it's healthy and live still, because a lot of them weren't. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a planner at the beginning of this project, what was it like to work with other interest groups? There were historic architects, there were a bunch of different people who had a vision for this project.
yeah,
What was that like?
there was a lot of different interests, and of course, everybody had their idea of what it should be. But basically, because we were using the regulations that were required of historic structures, we all had to come to the same conclusion, and that really made it much simpler than if we had all had our own ideas and going here and there and everywhere. I know that we all became pretty close friends, and like Pat Stryker and I hadn't seen her for a number of years now, but it was good to see her. Steve, forgot his name all of a sudden. Bill Mock, and all of us, we got to know each other real well through the whole process. But it all went well in the long run. I mean, there was lots and lots of concerns about budgets, and especially on the old Howard House, because that budget was blown very early and often. But it's a beautiful project now. One of the people that I really give a lot of credit to was Don Bonker. He was the congressman in this area at that time, and a good friend of mine, and has remained. He just passed away a year ago, and I'm doing a memorial for him down at the Stanger House, where he lived and was married 50 years ago last year. So he was a critical part of what the funding to make this work. And of course, there were congressmen. Many of them followed that, and you can list them all, and there's always been great support from Washington, D.C. with this project. There was a tree down on the second to last house down on the end here, before the freeway, that was some of the developers, some of the team wanted to cut down, and I kind of wanted it saved, and there was quite a debate about it, and somehow I managed to get done in the middle of it, and I wouldn't do that today, but I did at the time, and the tree got saved, and it's still there today. So I've always appreciated that happened, even though I don't know if that's the right way to do things, but at the time it seemed very important that we save that tree, and that just shows how much interest there was from the political world.
Yeah.
And of course, back when we first started this, back in the day, Magnuson and Jackson were the senators, very powerful people, and they helped make this thing happen too, because of their commitment to the area and the role, and understanding the federal government's part in that. And of course, you go way back to congressmen before that. There was people really committed to seeing this all saved as the Army was retreating from the area.
Yeah. Tell me about being a project manager for the O.O. Howard House.
Well, I was in it late in the game, and it was kind of the cleanup thing. We had a team. It was pretty well on its way to being complete, but somebody had to sign the papers and keep the thing moving. And so I was just maybe the last 6 months or a year of the project, and I wasn't intimately involved in hammering or nailing or any of that stuff. It was just making sure that the project, everybody kept moving forward and trying to get it done before the deadline that we had for events there. And I guess my interest was as much about the grounds around it. And of course, Ed Lynch had his visions of what it was, and I believe he paid for the benches that went in there. I'm almost sure the 6 benches around the Rose Garden, we were going to sell those to various people to have their name put on them, like his name is on a bench out here somewhere on the grounds. Of course, National Park Service eventually doesn't really like to do that. That's kind of against their regulations, but most of this happened before they really got involved, and I can understand their point of it, but when you're scraping for money, and they're not coming up with it for us. You kind of got to do what you got to do to keep things moving, as long as you're not doing, damage to the historical story. So that was a bit of a controversy, and we did put a bench right outside of the old Howard House for Ed Lynch, and he was a very powerful guy who had a vision for the property and really made a lot of things happen. So I didn't feel like I was stepping too much out of a line to do that for him, but that was for his 80th birthday, if I remember correctly. But I thought it was just an amazing project, and I've gone on to do a lot of projects privately since I left the city in '07. So I was involved heavily in Summer Grove Lodge. It's out east or north of town here. And I working on the Stanger House. That's the oldest house in Clark County on its original location, and I've done several of my own houses, and so I'm still doing that sort of thing. And I had the passion for historic preservation. So that, plus I was for a couple of years assigned as the arts and cultural facilitator for the city. I had an office over upstairs in the back of the Grant House. It was a little out of my league, but I did have an art degree. I went to school for art originally, so
Wow.
that was a part of my thing. So that was like herding cats. So with arts people, they're all very independent, and we started the Officers Row Ghost Stories here.
Oh, wow.
And that was a big deal. That was a big
tell me
hit.
about that.
Well, I was kind of, I had people doing that. I wasn't really, but that was an event we started, an annual event in October where people came in and they had various things going on in the different houses, and especially here and in the Grant House. And Ghost Stories was a big deal. Pat Gelato was a big part of that. A lot of events, and it became a pretty good event for a few years there, and it eventually kind of faded out. But
Is
my
Officers Row haunted?
well, they claim there's a couple of ghosts here and there in it. So
All good. It's evidence of modern technology.
yeah,
That's
sorry.
what we'll say about
Yeah. Anyway, that was good. And of course, early on in my career, thinking of this area, Vancouver was known for its big 4th of July celebrations. So in 1975, we had what we called the sesquicentennial, and that was basically here, and we did the 4th of July event, and I had owned a house just across the street over there before I bought the big house here. And so all those events in July were huge in '75, and then '76 we had 400,000 or 500,000 people packed in here for the big 4th of July celebration, and that was a big deal. So that's the '70s there was a lot of exposure to this area, and people really got supportive of the area because they knew the events that were going on here were big, and I got to know a lot of people, and they were really passionate about this property. So from today's world, probably city government couldn't do what we did at that time, but we were just small enough that we could do it, but big enough to get attention to do it. And of course, the rich history. I mean, you think about this house and George C. Marshall and all that. I mean, just that was fresh off the World War II. The '60s wasn't that long after. That was 25 years after the war. So there was still a lot of veterans and people that were willing to really step in, and of course the houses really were in bad shape. And some of them were, I think they would have preferred to bulldoze them. I'm glad they didn't, but especially the old Howard House, because it had burned. I don't know if you've seen the pictures, but it was pretty well gutted. So it was in bad shape.
Mm-hmm. And what was left when you came on as a project manager to do around the Howard House?
Well, I'm trying to think what exactly. It was just finish work, I think. Yeah. And we had everything was in place. It was just a matter of I wasn't having to really get too deeply into it. It was just to make sure that the people followed through on their commitments to the contracts.
Yeah.
It was, other than I had the landscape to work with. I didn't really have to do too much there.
Yeah, and tell me about the actual process of, I mean, you're on this great historic property. We've heard from a few other interviewees about kind of archaeology that was discovered and all that kind of stuff. What's it like to dig a bunch of holes?
Well, I wasn't part of that. I mean, that was why we were held back on landscaping for those reasons. Mm-hmm. But that was Steve Burdick's side of things.
Got it.
And so, we were held a lot back on a lot of things, a lot of times. Like the Nahanga, when we were doing that, we had to dig and be careful what we dug into out on this side of the house. But the real professionals that dug for that, they aren't landscapers. They're looking for something, and so they pretty much had to do everything they wanted to do before we were allowed to even come in and do anything. So, and that was. I'm sure others can tell you about most of that, but I do know that there was a lot of things found that were interesting, and it was a big topic as we moved along. But it also slowed things down, and it also frustrated a lot of people that when are you going to get done with this thing? And cost overruns and things like that were a big deal. So we had to try to be as good communicators to the community as anything, just to keep things moving without them really coming down on us too bad about government overspending. Mm-hmm. But I think all in all, we had such good support for the property that it worked out fine.
Yeah. Tell me about how you see Fort Vancouver, Officers Row, Central Park in the larger Vancouver community.
Well, it's kind of the heart of everything. I mean, it's what really started things. Fort Vancouver really was the Hudson Bay Company. That was the beginning of it all. But even before that, the trip, in 1989, we celebrated Captain Vancouver's famous trip up the west coast, and then Broughton's trip up the river. And I was in charge of a lot of the celebration for that. As we did that, that's how we really got the excitement for the waterfront. And of course, when we were doing this area, the Central Park, the waterfront was part of that, and so I was given the task to do the Columbia River Waterfront Renaissance program, and that had a lot to do with here, and that's how we were able to put that trail along the waterfront, through downtown, along Officers Row, and back downtown, back to the waterfront. And that all fit right into all this history, and it was stimulated by Captain Vancouver, the naming of it. We made trips. I made a trip to England and spent time in his birthplace, in his gravesite, all that with all the planning process we were doing. And then as soon as we got over that, then we started the planning for Lewis and Clark and their trip through the area. So that all tied in because that was part of the history as well.
Wow. So,
and of course, we used this building for so many of the events, the guests that came to town for all those events. We had so many, I can't tell you how many receptions we had here in this building.
Can you think of a couple off the top of your head?
Well, just one that personally I was involved in. After the restaurant closed and before after the restaurant closed and Nahanga was over as well. The house had been, a lot of things were done to make it a really nice gallery for showing their art. We did a lot of track lighting. You'd never know that what they did in this place. it was basically outside of the historical stuff, but it was a pretty nice museum, not museum, gallery for art. And lighting, walls were all white, and all this decorative was either hidden or accented, but it wasn't the main piece of it. And I did put on an art show with a community art show where I think 5 of us artists had our artwork here. I did a showing. I had a area in the back room there in the office as part of that. So that was just one event, but like the Marshall Awards, they've always been here. George C. Marshall Honor Award that they give every year has been here many times. And of course, we've had guests from Japan here, a lot of them over the years. And what else we have? It just seemed like, well, of course, I don't know if the Congress, is it still upstairs or is it over at the O. Howard House now?
I think there's a few Congress people who have offices upstairs.
Upstairs, yeah. Yeah, they used to be up there when I remembered for a while there. But so let's see, what else was there that we really did? We've always had the house open for the 4th of July. That's a biggie. And just the wallpaper stories of picking the wallpaper for this was a whole experience. Julie Garver, I don't know if you've heard her name come up in any of this. She was kind of the project manager for this house, and she did some of the interior works on. She worked for me for a few years there. She was in charge of sort of the interior projects of these houses, both this one and the O. Howard House. And she was really into the wallpaper stuff. I learned a lot. So a lot of this came from Europe, and I've been in Europe a number of times and seen the wallpaper and learned a lot from it, so I used that to explore some of the history over there, so that was fun. But it's a whole science in itself.
Yes, no kidding.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Tell me, did you, in planning, did you use any models, or did you follow any kind of landscape architect theory, or what was the kind of guiding force for your decisions?
Well, in the beginning, the first round, when we did this out front here, it was to pull away from the trees. We wanted to make it an interesting landscape, capturing as much of the memorabilia that had come, like the petroglyphs that were out front. We wanted to make a bigger deal about those so people could view them. They weren't just stuck in the grass. We had
petroglyphs.
What's that?
I don't know about the
Oh,
petroglyphs.
they used to be right here in front of the house. I'm not sure where they ended up getting put, but they came out of the gorge. At one time when they were building a road up there, they got brought down here. There was other things that were here. There was a monument that was a 5-sided thing that was out here that didn't fit with this, but it was, the things that the National Park Service would never allow today, but they did come in over the years. And so we were trying to make those more of the story. And I think in the end, what we ended up doing was good. But it didn't make for any creative room. You were following what you saw in a photograph. And I think that was, I had no problem with that. I enjoyed it, actually. Good seeing the houses brought back to a level. I don't know that we would be able to do it today, but maybe it's hard to say. One of the issues I had done a couple of grants that were downtown and down here at the Grants Potato Patch Monument. I don't know if you are aware with that area down there. And we had picked a light fixture for what we wanted to be a standard for the whole area. And it was the same light that we found in Esther Shore Park back when they first put electricity in the parks at all. And I duplicated that light in down here at that side of the down in the Potato Patch Monument area, and then it's also downtown there. And I wanted it all the way through the row as a standard, like the benches are standard. And somehow the light that's here got in instead, and I was kind of disappointed with that. So we had differences, but they were fine. They were just the way they went. And but all in all, if we hadn't been given the time and effort to, I was a city employee, and I would say a good 25% of my time was put in those early years was put to this area, and we had a whole city to deal with. So that was a good chunk of my time.
No kidding. Let me ask you one more question.
Sure.
What was your favorite memory working on Officers Row?
My favorite memory. Ooh.
Memories.
Yeah. There was favorite memories probably of each decade, because there was a lot of decades in there. I think actually that event that we had for the Arbor Day in 1989 would probably be the most impactful to the community from my point of view of what I was in charge of seeing success on. Those trees planted, and to see them today, where people knew this row of street trees all along here were the big mature trees. We were losing a lot of them, and now they're all back, and drive down there now with all the beautiful color. I think that particular event was probably the biggie in my life. It certainly helped us bring a lot of the community to the table, and kids at the right age where they really, I know that this town today is more sensitive about urban forestry because of that than anything else. So I would have to probably say that would be my most exciting moment, but we had a lot of others too.
Yeah.
The Nahanga exhibit, they only did that 3 places around the world. If I'm not, it was either 3 or 5 places around the world, and they picked Vancouver as one of them. Pretty exciting. But in the bigger scheme, I had 36 years of a lot of events, a lot of things that happened. I would say Officers Row was one of the biggest, most exciting. The waterfront obviously was the biggest for me, but this was right up there, second in line to the waterfront.
Yeah.
So.
And I did lie, because I do have Pat Stryker told us a little, maybe, I don't know if it's a secret or not, but that in every park that you worked on, there's a pine tree. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I tried to always put, she and I talked as I went out the door here, and she said it wasn't an indigenous pine tree, but it was because it's a coast pine. And yes, I did try to put a signature piece in every park. And
is there a coast pine in Officers Row?
There is.
Where is it?
I'll let you find it.
Okay. Are there any questions that you wish that I had asked you?
Well, I'm just pleased that you guys are doing this. It's so important to capture this history. And I just had a very good friend pass away that's younger than me, who had a lot of history. And so it's really important to capture this information. So I appreciate what Holly and the group over there are doing to capture this history. It is certainly one of the finer moments of Vancouver, and the fact that the Reserve Trust is still alive and well and kicking, and a lot of good people have come and gone from there, but they still got work to do, and they're on the right track. But I want the model that they have done to live on, because I think other communities that I know of could learn from us. And I hope if anything, that's what this interview and other interviews that the others are doing will culminate in.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.